this conversation will hopefully open us with a kickstart into a lot of the main issues I think that are on our minds for the day. Museums, of course, we see them as a microcosm for much larger issues within our culture and society. And they hold a very special place, certainly for us museum people, but really for American culture at large. This is a point of pride for everyone who works in museums, and it's repeated ad infinitum, but museums have a much higher level of social trust than almost every other institution you can think of in America, including obviously the federal government, but also journalism, universities. It's something special about how museums are embedded within their communities, reflect and respond to those communities. And so we're going to get into both the opportunities that affords all of us today, but also some of the liabilities. Now, just to give you a little bit of context, I went back and tried to find some of the earliest examples of climate change exhibits. This is from 1969, right? So this is 15 years before the famous moment in the Senate where a sort of bomb dropped in terms of climate change. This is an exhibit called Can Man Survive? It's at the American Museum of Natural History. And it was seen as an early form of blockbuster, right? And you can see here, it was very edgy in terms of its design. They actually tried to create something that would compete with the sci-fi blockbuster of its day, Kubrick's 2001. That was the big idea. And so you can see, even in some of the projected images of pollution and smog, it told a riveting but horrifying story about ecological degradation, climate change, overpopulation. And so when we look at these early, literally like 3 generations ago, ideas in terms of how to engage the public, which is really the topic for today's conversation, you think, was this a success? And I hate to say it, but in fact, it was not a success, right? Turns out, scolding your visitors does not work very effectively. So that's true today. It was true back then. The museum itself licked its wounds, recovered, and a generation later opened this exhibit, the Hall of Biodiversity, which was seen almost as an inversion of the strategy. They wanted to delight and overwhelm visitors with the bountiful beauty of the natural world. I actually engaged directly. This is the beginning of my career. I worked on this as a designer. This is a diorama of the Central African rainforest. I will say with some chagrin, the harder hitting science around the 6th extinction, around climate change, was subsequently taken out and changed and shifted. So it is an ongoing dialogue in terms of the effectiveness, the efficacy of these types of exhibitions. Now, just to give you a little background, the firm that I started designed the 9/11 Memorial Museum, Planet Word. This is the Greenwood Rising, which is the Tulsa Race Massacre Museum. So a lot of very hard-hitting experiences. And in this case, we started getting interested in the overlap between advocacy and what's called the call to action. How do you put people into motion after seeing these types of experiences? And so we designed this in this case, where you would fill in your own idea of what you would do to fight against racial oppression. And actually, we studied it, and that small amount of customization made a big impact in terms of how willing people were to make these changes. And as I started looking at climate, this is really, really, really important. And why? When you look at the IRA, the so-called climate bill, right, America's big federal solution for climate, you discover something kind of strange, or at least for me as an outsider, it was really weird. The estimate is anywhere from $300 billion to $1.2 trillion. That seems odd, right? Like, how would you write this mammoth piece of legislation, not know how much it's going to cost? But that's because there's tax grants, tax breaks, and grants built into about 2/3, if not 3/4 of that funding. And if you let that sink in, what that actually means, it means that every school, hospital, business, church, and local government will have to voluntarily decarbonize. So when you let that sink in, you think to yourself, well, who are these people who are going to actively ask for these solutions? And we have a paradigm for this. This is called the adoption curve for new innovations. It's very big in Silicon Valley, but well proven elsewhere. And when you look at it, you think to yourself, oh, right, these folks here, the early adopters, those are the climate people. Those are arguably the people here in this room, or the people who you know think before they fly, think before they eat burgers, think before they purchase new things, right? Like, that market has responded to the call to action that we've essentially put out for the last decade, which is the carbon footprint. The carbon footprint really focuses us on as individuals and as consumers, a sort of mass market way for us to rethink consumption, which is frankly, a good message. It has good intentions. But frankly, it hasn't worked with these people, right? The majority of Americans have not been moved by that call to action. And so that is, again, why I think museums are so incredibly important. These folks are actually the majority of Americans, right? They're really worried about climate. It's not inconvenient truth time anymore. You don't need to convince any people with the extremity of weather that this is real. That said, they don't talk about climate, and they definitely don't do anything about climate. Right? So that's a huge opportunity. And again, if you tie that to the IRA success, it's vital. It's critical. It's really, really important. Just to show you some provocations, this is a project that I've been developing called the Accelerator. And essentially, it started looking at the call to action from the bottom-up approach. Not so much what's the one solution we would give to everybody, which is the carbon footprint, but what's the specific solution we would give to just you or you, based on where you work, where you live, how you invest, if you have kids or not. The lever that you would pull in that case, not as an individual, but as a member of a system, is really, really different. So if you look here, those are the actual things you would do to change K through 12 schools. And then I also gathered all of these case studies for what I call future makers, people who are actually creating a different form of future, not really climate people who do it for a living, but in this case, school teachers, parents, members of a teachers union. We also built this is an immersive experience that after you make that choice to make a different action, you can see that effect on your own community. So it also switches some of the way that communication is often made about this is a world event, it's terrible for people over there, whether the over there is you're in Florida and you're looking at LA or vice versa, or you're in New York and you're looking at Pasadena. It's like, no. We can build this just for your own city, where you live, and show literally how the temperature goes down as people take action. It's really trying to connect those dots really, really clearly, that it's about you, the actions that you take, and how to make those changes. And you'll see inside of here, this in particular, and this is what I want to get to with everybody, really circumvents the question, the age-old question, and this conference embodies it. Is it more effective to tell negative stories, right? The so-called doom and gloom we were literally just talking outside, or positive stories, right? And in this case, it tells something a little more complicated that I think museums are really good at. It tells a conditional story. And if you look at neuroscience, humans are literally bad at that idea. We're really, really incapable of thinking too far in the future. It's why we have 401ks. Social Security is why we trick ourselves literally into saving for our future selves. It also plays a role in obesity and smoking and all these other horrible things we do to our future selves. And with that, I wanted to invite our 4 speakers to come up. We're going to have a conversation about exactly these types of topics. Please come join us. The way I'd like to run this is I'm going to do, instead of sort of straight introductions, which everyone has to live through, I'm going to ask the first question in the course of the introduction. So, Alison Brown, thank you for being here. You've had an amazing career, certainly before the Science Museum of Minnesota, both with a business background as well as administrative, and worked at Cal Academy, which was a leader within the museum industry. But this slide, while it looks dry, maybe especially for folks in the room who chart this kind of thing, might set your heart aflutter, right? The fact that carbon footprint went down by that amount in a decade is nothing short of extraordinary. I wanted to ask you first and foremost, does this have something to do with just the scale of your institution? Is it the community that you're part of, the board leadership you had? Did it come bottom up from the staff, or was it a demand? Or how, in short, did that happen?
Oh, thank you for having us here today and having me here and for that question. And I think as with many things in life, there's never one clear answer to what it is. I would say that our museum started off as a natural history museum, and then in the 60s, a trustee went to install the exploratorium and then said, oh, you should be more hands-on. And then we added all sorts of other things. So it's very much been an innovative institution over its years. And in terms of the climate footprint, I would say there's dedicated staff who are working on reducing our climate footprint. And this started in 2013, and our big change was putting in a heat recovery system, and that lowered and building systems lowered our carbon footprint by 40%. So I think it's a combination of things, but we have strong support from the board. We didn't always. but we do now. And the state of Minnesota is a state that's trying to reduce its carbon footprint across the state and really be a place where people can inspire and take care of the planet.
That's amazing. Congratulations. Yes, well deserved, well deserved. So from there, I want to turn to Sean Decatur. And this, on purpose, it's a very, very different scale. He's now, of course, the head of the American Museum of Natural History, but he started as a trained biophysical chemist, and he rose as a scientist. He both ran and founded different labs. Then he ran Kenyon College, and now he's running AIM&H. And I would imagine, and have seen this from others, there's this real tension between scientists, right, who are steeped in the science, and you see it from the IPCC reports, who are literally screaming about the oncoming apocalypse, and not a matter of sort of editorial opinion, but just like straight data. And the tension between that and then how you would actually engage the public productively. And obviously you sit at the epicenter of that. Do you feel the two sides of yourself sort of at war within those pieces?
Well, thank you. And one of the things I think that is, it's an important role for museums in this is to open up the window into how the scientific process works and why we understand where we are now on the emergence of really existential questions around climate. I think that there is often there's a tendency, I think you're right, that scientists have been sounding the warning alarms loudly for a while now, but often still keep much of the data, the information, the process that underlies that a bit hidden from view. One of the things I think museums can do very well, especially science museums, natural history museums, is to walk people through the evidence and the process and sort of uncover a lot of that underlies it. And we've tried that in a few places in the museum. One of the things that we've recently brought out, which I'm quite proud of, is what we call the collections core, which explains, takes objects from the museum, explains actually where the objects came from, why we collect them, but then actually also how scientists are actually using them and what's the relevance of the way scientists are using them to the questions, to the critical questions that we have. And I think it's that bringing people along to explain the process that actually closes a bit of the gap between where scientists are and where many people are, that I think can be effective at explaining where we are in climate.
I think that's amazing, and I think in particular, you'll see a contrast now with our third speaker, because he's not the head of a science museum, he's the head of the art museum. So this is Franklin Sermons, director of the Perez Art Museum of Miami. Before that, you were a contemporary art curator at LACMA, and before that at the Menil. And also you did amazing work at the Brooklyn Museum, not far from where I grew up, with the Basquiat show. I think there's an amazing tension between the sciences and the arts that Franklin in particular has this amazing quote that talks to it. You once said that the full arc of your career hinges on this one question: how do we make the work sing? How do you bring forward difficult or sometimes challenging ideas and make them palatable or even seductive to a wide audience? That is our job, and I certainly couldn't say it better. That said, I do worry how that idea of seduction applies to climate and whether or not our audience is just, as Sean was identifying, too weary, too numb to really engage. What are your thoughts?
Thank you, Jake. Thank you for that. First, I think that we have an image of the museum, but I want to say that as being in a fine arts museum, right, and being able to follow directors of science museums is a wonderful position to be in. We deal with speculative fictions. We deal with images, right? And so we have this power to speak, I think, in ways that are open to interpretation and allow for us to approach these ideas with an elasticity that you might not within the Science Museum. So first and foremost, there is that.
Yeah.
Being in an art museum, I think we have an audience that is there and willing to engage in ways that they are not in science museums. I have the benefit of working in a museum that already has a conversation with climate embedded inside of it. Having worked in those other places and worked, seeing museums getting built, leaving LA at a time when they're in the midst of building another museum at LACMA right now. These questions are paramount, and I think what you see with our museum is this kind of inside-outside formation of architecture and structure that is built off of a relationship with this environment specifically, and very specifically to a place called Stiltsville, which is just down the way in Biscayne Bay. So we sit on these stilts, with climate change in mind, in Miami, and in the last few years with the rapidly changing weather. That may not be enough, but it is something that puts us in a position to carry forward these types of conversations in meaningful ways. And again, that idea of being in a space that is about the speculative and the image, I think, is the thing that allows for us to touch audience. I think foundationally about a project that happened that one might call the beginning of contemporary art in Miami in some ways, which is Christo and Jean-Claude's Surrounded Islands. Right? It happened in 1983. Our founding director, Jan van der Mark, did that exhibition before opening the museum 6 months later down on Flagler. And that project, I think, to many people, certainly to myself when I first saw the images, was only up for 2 weeks. Pretty hard to believe because it's left such a vast imprint in our minds, and the images that follow, pink fabric surrounding islands in Biscayne Bay, what Christo and Jean-Claude called Miami Central Park. So we have these foundational things. We have imagery, we have speculative fiction to play with that can be very enticing for audiences.
That's amazing. And I definitely want to return both to the idea of enticing audiences, but also to the hyper-local sensitivity to climate that your institution obviously touches on. But lastly, I wanted to talk to Paula. So full disclosure, Paula and I are old friends, but it has more to do with our shared interest in design and sometimes ice cream than it does to do with specifically climate. She's the senior curator of the Department of Architecture and Design at MoMA, as well as the director of research and development. I will say, without prompting, that Paula's career has been one of incredible prescience for decades, right? Being able to see far, far in front of the curve, and you will take great delight in terms of just the names alone of her last two major projects, Broken Nature and Design Emergency, which you're doing with Alice Roshorn, proves out that moment. So my question to you is sort of building on what we were just hearing in terms of audience engagement. What are the either projects or approaches that you found and seen, either for yourself or for others, and we're putting this up as the MoMA slide, that really have created a level of impact that you've seen itself? And how do you differentiate between just engagement and impact, or how do you think about that?
Good examples are much more powerful than bad examples. And, there are many nuances in between apocalyptic doomsayer and Pollyanna, right? So I went from, because I'm a design curator, so I observe life. So what Jay calls prescience, it's just observation, because design follows the evolution of society. I have learned that it's so powerful when you show optimism. So in 2013, I did a project called Design and Violence that was not optimistic at all. It was about trying to understand the manifestations of violence in contemporary society by looking at ambiguous objects of design. From the Kalashnikov, you would say, why is it ambiguous? Because it's a great object of design, but it's like a terrible instrument of death. Or, many other, the 3D printed gun. So all of these weird examples. So that definitely was slightly pessimistic. Broken Nature went instead into this area of the guarded optimism. It's a very familiar area for designers because you have limitations and then you thrive within those limitations. So the idea behind Broken Nature was we will become extinct. We have no control over that fact. What we can control is a little bit the when, and we have a lot of control on the how. And if we design a good extinction for ourselves, we will not be remembered as complete morons by the next dominating species. So there was like this strange kind of joyful way to approach the sixth extinction. And the exhibition happened first in Milan. I'm Milanese. Milanese citizens are interested in design. So you're talking about impact. Well, they they flocked to the exhibition, not just because somebody told them to take the vitamins of art or of design. They came because they were interested. And it was the time in 2018 of the Fridays for the Future. Young kids were manifesting, taking Fridays off. And the kids would meet at my show and start marching from there. Excuse me, I still get shivers down my spine because that means that it's true impact. And then lately, I've gone even more to the other side of the fence because of a great friend, Ayana Elizabeth Johnson. She's an oceanographer and climate justice, expert, and she's about to publish a book. The title is "What If We Get It Right?" ? And she interviewed a lot of people, and myself included, asking that question. And that question made me think in a completely different way, in a way that that starts from the positive and kind of retraces the steps, like when you give advice to young people for career and you say, write your press release 10 years from now. Same thing, try to imagine what if we got it right, which doesn't mean that everything is pink and perfect, but we are moving forward. So I believe firmly, and what you see there are two exhibitions. Recent one on the left-hand side is my beloved colleague Carson Chan, who is the director of the Emilio Ambas Institute for the Environment and the Built Environment. Sometimes I forget titles, but it's about architecture and the environment. And it's about the birth of the environmental movement in architecture in the 1960s and 70s. Wonderful things. And on the right-hand side is an exhibition that I have up right now that is called Life Cycles, that talks about the fact that objects are just a moment in the life cycle of materials between extraction and whatever will happen in the end. And so both exhibitions show beauty. Beauty not in terms of prettiness, but in terms of like formal intention. Without sacrificing beauty, elegance, sensuality, we can be responsible. So it's possible, and that's what we try to show.
I love that within the milieu, both of design as well as with art. And I think the capacity to seduce with aesthetics is something that obviously you have at your discretion. I want to just touch on your journey because it's actually similar or parallel, but obviously from the scientific bent. Do you want to talk a little bit about the sort of exhibition overhaul that you're making for the entire experience?
Happy to do that. So our museum has been in this location. It's on the Mississippi River, down a cliff, and it has been in that location 25 years. And as we were thinking about that space and how we're using it, how can we make it more effective? How can we make it relevant to the audience today? A little bit about around the design aspect that you're thinking of. How can we make the visitor flow better? And we're using an organizing principle around climate change as we design these changes, as we implement them. So we're built down a cliff, so we're 6 stories tall. And the climate change exhibit will be 6 stories, and then each element of the exhibit on climate change will be about the theme from that floor. And that's the way that we're thinking about organizing our work. But it's actually a lot like this conference. What are the solutions we already have that we can put into place now? How can we inspire people to think about change? Not nag them, but inspire them to create change at the individual level, the family level, organizationally, as a community, as a state, as a nation, as a world. So those are the scales we're thinking about moving up as we think about climate change, and really think about climate change's impact around equity. What does it mean to be human? How does it have this inequitable impact on humanity? Not just out in Bangladesh, but also right here in St. Paul, where the museum is located. Those are the stories that we want to inspire change and really taking action.
Just as a follow-up, and then I want to hear from Sean, because he has a sort of different scale problem again, or opportunity as well. How do you measure success in that case? And does the sort of visitor behavior, the changes, the shifts, the impact actually play a role in that?
Yeah, the short answer is yes. And we actually, Sean and I had dinner last night, we was talking about this. We have about 15 PhDs on staff who measure the effectiveness of our exhibits, both from a learning perspective, so the outcomes that we stated for an exhibit or an educational program, were those achieved at the end? And that's not by us saying it, it's by the visitors, what they report back to us. And we also measure how much they enjoyed the experience. Because we know if it's not a joyful experience, it's hard to take it in and take action. And the number one reason why people go to museums is for that shared experience with family and friends, which means they come in actually with an open framework, an open way of thinking that we think is really powerful, and not to take advantage of, but to use that as a way to move people into action.
Super interesting. And I think obviously the tension between description, storytelling, a sort of cross-section of what's happening from a scientific perspective is really sometimes seen at odds with advocacy. And that delicate balance is part of that social trust that museums have established and I know are very careful to hold on to. Sean, do you want to talk a little bit about, and if you feel envious, you can feel free to share, how it is that the institution of AM&H, and I know that you were describing, your biggest one day is as big as her biggest month. Is that correct? Right, so this is a very, very different scale to be running literally the second largest museum by visitation in America. Do you want to talk about that as an opportunity, but also as a challenge, both the physical scale, but also the incredible diversity, both embedded in New York, but also international tourism?
Yes, and I think that there's an opportunity there, but actually I think the opportunity even reaches more broadly. And I'd say that, to me, traditional visitation to the museum, sort of only one tool or mechanism that we have to advance sort of goals of broader public understanding, and actually I think at least in the context of climate, broader sort of public action or activation around issues of climate. Because we have, for example, our exhibits and the ways in which we engage in visitors in that context. And, that is often a brief or sort of momentary short interaction. We also have our education programs, which can reach out to students in terms of field trip visits, but also deeper collaborations with teachers. And in much of the work that we're doing, how do we align our exhibits, the information that we have at the museum, to education standards to actually help teachers better integrate the latest knowledge to advance on the education in classrooms ranging from elementary through high school around topics such as climate. And that critical work sort of expands from our visitation expands to the full New York City public school district, which is about 1 million students that we reach sort of in a deeper way from an educational perspective. It involves materials that we can connect in from things at the museum to be able to develop curriculum materials we put online to engage in teachers nationally that extend our reach in that direction. And so if I think about the full reach of the museum, they're the 5 million visitors that we have that come through the door. They're the teachers that we work with that bring this to their classrooms sort of year after year in an extended way. They're the materials that we put out online, which can have a national or global reach. And we have to think about all of these tools because, in a sense, if it's not just about what we can do to capture attention just in a moment, but what we can do to have a long-term sustained effort to engage, cajole, sort of convince folks about what the issues are and hopefully actually activate them to some sort of action down the road.
So just a quick follow-up before we go back to Franklin. You've also talked a lot about how museums have this very special place in this moment of extreme polarization. Right, both in terms of being geographically located, embedded within these communities, capable of hosting these dialogues. Do you feel ever that that's sort of strange to the extent that, yes, you want to welcome people with different points of view, but again, as a science institution and a scientist, there really isn't a diversity of points of view in terms of climate change. How do you deal with that struggle about engaging the public, not alienating people, but still being truthful to the science?
Yeah. And I think actually, the data you showed on surveys of attitudes about climate, I think are a really good point in that the majority of Americans are already worried about climate, right? That they don't need convincing, that isn't the big divide. There's a segment that find that climate is overblown or they don't believe in climate, but I think sometimes we let that small segment sort of lose sight of what I think those data illustrated as the more critical problem is that they're already convinced that there's something going on that deserves worry. They're not yet activated to turn that worry into something that they can do and to understand how that worry gets translated into some sort of not only hope for the future, but steps they can take to move towards hope for the future. And that's the place where I think the museum, that's the sweet spot for the museum. So we can bring in, and that's a place where it's not saying that we are inviting in evolution is a good example. We are a natural history museum. Evolution is kind of fundamental to what we do. We would not invite in views on intelligent design as kind of a part of an equal play in our museum. Similarly, I think that climate is something that is, the scientific consensus of climate being real. We aren't going to invite in opinions that are outside of that norm of where scientific consensus lies. But we can create a lot of space for different types of social views that may have different mechanisms of how they want to respond or how they will respond about that. And I do think there's some fertile ground that we haven't really explored broadly as a society about, what are the ways in which you can approach questions of climate that appeal to evangelical religious views,
Yep.
right? Where the notion of stewardship of the planet is something that might appeal to some groups that, again, kind of as part of that, there were folks who are worried about it but haven't been activated. So creating space for those types of dialogue is something that I think museum can do well, and it's keeping an eye on the real conversion is the folks who are worried but not yet activated.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think at least in some of the research that I was showing, there's this strange way in which, and Paolo was touching on it with Ayana's work, that because the solutions that we've been offered in the general media, again, are very personal and individual, you in some level, or I'll put it this way, I was having a conversation with someone at the conference, they're like, oh, I'm perfect for your messages. I was like, why? She was like, well, I compost, but I kind of think it doesn't matter. I recycle, and I know that's total BS, and I vote, and my vote doesn't count. Right? Like, that's literally what we tell people to do. And the level of sort of mental health, I think, ricochet you're seeing across this is because the solutions we've afforded to people are, again, sort of deflating. So trying to stock, as you're saying, pathways to efficacy for all of us is so incredibly critical. And in terms of Miami, how does that play itself out to engage such an incredibly diverse group of people? And in particular, I was struck, and you should know this about, frankly, he's done a number of times this amazing exhibition called The Beautiful Game about football, which engages obviously both popular culture and sports as well as contemporary art. Does some of that magic find its way into your thinking about climate?
Almost. I think,
Okay.
I have to be honest. I mean, I think this is an inflection point for us as an institution at this point in time.
Yeah.
We have been in the building 10 years. As you just mentioned, I think all of my staff would agree with everything you just used in that example. Their vote doesn't matter. What is this little bin that we have over here that we're putting plastic in for no reason?
Right.
There's so much of that just embedded within us. So, for instance, in this moment, we have an exhibition up right now, a small exhibition called Sea Change. And it's literally about the environment. It's about placing one in the environment. I need that piece in that show as well to give the science of how people can actually change what's going to happen in 2050. Right? So it's a walk-in environment. You're surrounded by screens. These kind of questions automatically come to the fore, which is where we all start, which is where we begin. It's that fertile ground. Likewise, we're about to open an exhibition in a couple of weeks called Spirit in the Land. It's a show that comes from the Nasher Museum at Duke, done by my co-curator of all of those football exhibitions, Trevor Schoonmaker. And so that is another way of having an exhibition that will be up at exactly the same time that forces people to consider conversations around the environment, around climate, around landscape and its grand tradition in terms of museums and painting. So all of those things are at play. There's also a core conversation around indigeneity and how we talk about that in this question, which is really, really, really complicated as well. So what we're trying to do is, okay, we got to this point. We're putting these things forward. And the next stage is what do we do Like, what do we physically do as a group of people who do have some agency, who do have the opportunity to work collectively in the space of a museum, which, as you said, can be a trusted space. So what we plan to do, and now this is where we have to get some of those grants that are in that chart, is that we are going to have a healthy conversation around decarbonization within our museum. We've begun, and it's another one of those beautiful coincidences of COVID, which led to rapid change in the fact that we send paintings and sculptures all around the world on big, huge planes all the time. And we even put people with them, right? So now in this conversation, we were forced to actually put little video monitors inside the crates instead of sending so many couriers. So we're accelerating some degree of change. We are listening, we are trying, but I think that's the next step.
No, I think that's amazing. And that's actually why I wanted to open with Allison and her institution, having done a lot of survey work. Who are the people who are not just talking the talk, but walking the walk? You always hear about this institution, right? This is like not top of mind in terms of fancy, the museum world, the Mets and the MoMAs of the world, which are incredible institutions. But from a sustainability standpoint, an institution that has, again, through all the different layers that you're discussing, actually figured out how to radically shrink your carbon footprint is just exquisite. And I think that's one of the challenges I would imagine for an institution is how to both pay for it, as you said, but also how to then try and engage the public with a story about it. I heard an awful anecdote from the Exploratorium, if you know. They also have a amazing sustainability story to tell. They moved to this existing building, early days, LEED Platinum building, et cetera. They put up a huge exhibit about all of the incredible sustainability efforts on behalf of the building and tore it out in 18 months because they were like, nobody cared, nobody looked, nobody paid attention to it. And that's a secret suspicion of mine that this work doesn't get enough play because it's actually so mundane. It's just like, it's insulation, it's heat pumps. It's, it's the same thing in our popular imagination. We don't actually talk about it that much because it's just the same old, same old. And for you, in terms of your institution, how are you able to keep climate central in terms of the board itself? Is that an ongoing conversation? Are they driving you? Or are you sort of leading them or pointing to your visitors who are asking for it? What's that like?
Yeah, so first off, I love the Exploratorium. I read every panel.
Oh,
I went there in opening time. It's in a beautiful location, right, also on the waterfront on the bay. In terms of driving this, we actually have three themes that we're focused on now. One is evolution, whether our board has approved statement on evolution, statement on diversity and equity and inclusion. In 2018, that was approved, and then they approved a statement on climate change in 2007, but it was not a very strong statement on climate change, and that was contentious at the time to have it approved. So we just reaffirmed that and changed it in 2015 or I don't remember when, a year ago, whenever that was, and had that updated. So the board is very much aligned around those three themes, a little bit like what Sean was talking about. We are a science of, we're going to talk about evolution. We're going to talk about climate change. We're going to talk about equity in our work. And we know that people who come in aren't all in the same place. We know like 30% of our visitors don't believe in evolution, yet they still come to the museum and have a great experience. So to us, it's more important that we are aligned around those themes from a staff level, a board level, and a community level, and then people can come in and experience in the way that they want to experience.
That's amazing. And I really want to touch on the way that Paula, as well as you, are trying to engage this diverse audience. And I also wanted to pick up on what Franco was talking about, and I don't want to project, but I assume there's some sort of generational question embedded in what you're talking about, of the conversations that your staff is bringing up and even the challenges that they're bringing to you. Paula, you, again, are sort of always on the forefront of things. How are you finding those conversations with either younger folks or folks in the industry who might have a more radical point of view maybe than MoMA in general? Is that a challenge in terms of being able to put work forward that feels, as you say, embodying a positivist version of the future?
No, not at all. I think that the biggest challenge is to find space in the galleries and on the calendar and the budget. I don't have, the people that I have the hardest time convincing sometimes are my colleagues, the ones that decide which exhibitions go where. And then once the exhibition is up, people flock to it, whether they find themselves in a familiar zone or whether it's something new to learn. Design really cuts across, immediately makes a connection. And I always think there are 6 curatorial departments at MoMA, and I always think that film and design and maybe photography are the ones that immediately engage people without any need to translate. And so in Milan or in New York, I feel that people respond to design very openly, and it's a way, design is a Trojan horse for very serious messages.
So we have a couple more questions up top, but then you all are invited to ask questions, so get prepared. I'd like to touch in terms of that as the Trojan horse. If we could, just go around and in a sentence or 3 or 5, talk about both the Trojan horse that you would employ going forward and also why that might give you a little bit of hope and optimism about your institution and climate. Do you want to start, Sean?
Sure. And for me, it's it's thinking about ways that the museum reaches beyond its walls to build partnerships. And to build on the example of how we can talk about our own efforts through exhibition, use exhibition to talk about our own decarbonization efforts. If you imagine, what if we do that in collaboration with community groups where the exhibit is connected to activation on how people can do that with their own homes, right? And you begin thinking of the museum not just as something where people get informed and then take that elsewhere, but we actively build the types of partnerships that take the information, connect it to nonprofits, community-based organizations which do that type of activation well, and through partnership extend our reach. So that's the thing which actually gives me hope of changing how museums are positioned in the conversation.
And that obviously feels both authentic but also activating, right? Because they can go there and see those community groups literally engage with them or the comparable version of them in their own community. Franklin, thoughts? What inspires you and or what's the Trojan horse that you think you're going to be moving forward with?
Well, again, I'm speaking from a place of good fortune in that half of the time that we've been open, we have a Museum of Science that opened in 2017, literally right next door. And I truly believe that for the first time since I've been here, we have an incredible partnership that is budding between our director's office, Doug Roberts, and his whole entire team. We've begun to do simple collaborations out on what we call the Night Plaza, which sits in between our 2 buildings. But the sky's the limit in that regard. And so we know we're speaking from a point of early stage, and it is Miami. We've only existed for 40 years. Again, that Science Museum has been around longer, but only in this building for 5 years. So we have this chance to speak about art and science together intrinsically in a way that I'm really excited about.
That sounds very powerful. Do you have specific plans that you can share? What are types of engagements or interventions?
So we're here in Miami and we're sitting here on Miami Beach, right?
Yep.
There's this thing that gets talked about here in terms of climate and gentrification that
Yep.
I think you would be hard pressed to find other places where the conversation is so vibrant, or probably should be more vibrant, right? But it's challenging. I don't live on the beach. How many people in here live on the beach? Wow, see? A few, not very many. So we live in Miami. It's a little bit different, right? We have a little bay between us, but these things are really paramount right now.
Yep.
And you see it happening so rapidly.
Yeah.
So we want to be a part of that conversation. Those are our staff. Those are the people that we are.
Yeah. And being able to, again, similar to what Sean was saying, document that, but maybe also provide resources for direct conduit into action could be quite critical.
Absolutely.
Paola, you introduced the idea of the Trojan horse in a very optimistic thought.
Yeah, I just live by Trojan horses. It's my specialty. It's my specialty. So because design is an agent of change, it's almost easier to give people agency and give people tactics. You know, Sean was talking about it, and Broken Nature started with this like big panel of 45 new ideograms. You know, ideograms are those symbols that, like, the elevator is here, the toilets are here, etc. So they represented all these different tactics, from reducing waste to using waste as a new material, recycling, upcycling, you know, you name it. You know, I'm sure you had them too. Just go to your grandmother and she has like 15 of these. So telling people what they could do when they got home to just have fun while being more responsible. But my real Trojan horse from now on, and I want to get a tattoo, is Ayana's motto, what if we get it right? I mean, seriously, it is such a powerful way. And asking that question of people, all of a sudden, it's like asking a quiz, a psychological quiz, right? Immediately you feel engaged. What if we get it right? You start thinking. So that's going to be my Trojan horse.
That is fantastic. And your thoughts?
Yeah, I might follow along with that. I love that. And I had never thought about a Trojan horse as being a positive experience, but maybe I need to rethink myself. But I would say our Trojan horse is using storytelling. And it's not storytelling from us, it's storytelling from different community members we partner with, back to like what Sean talked about, lots of partnerships. And that, I think, is the best way to help us have an impact, is through storytelling, so that people can see themselves in the experience and think about what action can they take. That's one of the things we're leaning into.
Terrific. So now it's your chance to ask any questions. I think we have someone with a microphone who's going to be able to go around.
Hi, thanks very much. My name is Laura Hesse-Fisher. I run MIT's Climate Communications program. I'm loving this panel. It's been such an informative and exciting conversation, so thank you. I was really struck, Allison, when you were talking about how you have 15 PhDs that are focused on measuring and evaluating the impact. And Paolo, you talked about the students that gathered at your exhibition, and these are all measures of impact. I'm wondering if you could all speak to this a little bit more. How do you articulate the impact goals of your exhibitions, and how do you measure them?
Sure, I'll start. It's a combined effort where we are data driven. We do want to know what people want to see, and so we've been doing a lot more data collection and analysis within the last couple of years. But to call it an exact science for us would be favorable. So there are those regular numbers. Unfortunately, we still do grade ourselves by attendance, and we're fortunate that it's been increasing since COVID. Feel like we're back into the same place or better than where we were before. So very happy about that. But it also comes down to a lot of anecdotal information that is drawn from educational programming, and literally reading the conversations that happen in those spaces and creating a space for people to feel heard, if you will. For instance, within our larger special exhibition galleries right now, one is able to comment on the exhibition itself and to place that directly on the wall. Another way that we've tried to be more engaging, especially in light of COVID, which was like, okay, don't touch anybody, don't talk to anyone, was that we placed an artist downstairs in the actual museum space, a working artist who is making their work and freely engaging in conversation with other people and having an exchange. And it's made the experience a lot more tangible on a personal level. So trying to do those things to both keep that upward trend, make sure people are seeing what they want to see at the museum and want to come back, and also having more personalized or bespoke engaging experiences.
Yes, and so we do work in evaluating visitor experience and use that to as direct feedback of how to make changes to exhibition in terms of how people are engaging with the content. I think on the education front is the place where there's some really both interesting learnings and really interesting opportunities, in the sense that the general field of learning in informal environments and what are the added benefits of a place like a museum to supplement the type of work that goes on in a standard K through 12 setting, for example. is a really rich area of research right now, and it's one that both we're engaged in at the museum with some of our staff, but then also trying to integrate those learnings. And that's a place where, thinking about the museum experience not just as a freestanding experience for some of our visitors, but something that is actually integrated into a broader set of, whether it's through their schoolwork or a broader set of community and educational context, is important for us. And that area, how to get the sort of maximum feedback between whether it's a school experience in the museum or what's happening in a community at the museum, but sort of that full context where the museum experience fits in, is something that we're interested in.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Sophia Donskoy. I'm actually one of Aspen's future leaders, so I'm here repping Gen Z. I'm really keen on the idea of making climate a part of our culture, so thank you all for your contributions. I wanted to know what advice you might have for young people who do want to get involved in something like climate communication at a museum, since this space can be like pretty opaque, pretty ivory tower sometimes.
I'm happy to take a first stab at this, and I would say, so there's going to be a very interesting sea change in leadership at museums across the nation. There's a whole slew of people my age who have been in museums. I've been in museums 25 years, who are going to be retiring soon. So I think that there are going to be a lot of opportunities, not that we're necessarily in the way, not trying to be in the way, but a lot of opportunities for movement and action within museums. And the Gen Z and other generations are really helping us understand, helping people, in my generation, understand what we need to do now. So I think that there's an ability to get in at a time that may seem like it's daunting, and there's not actually, but it's going to be a lot of change within the industry.
Yeah, I'll also say I spent my career in museums. I love museums. Now that I'm working a lot in climate, I'm also seeing lots of adjacent areas that could also use an enormous amount of help, and in particular that Gen Z has massive advantages in. So you see like climate and comedy, you see climate and science fiction, or cli-fi as they call it. Or in my case, I'm trying to figure out how to partner with small and medium-sized cities or corporations that have large green stories to tell to reach way outside of museums. Museums are amazing, I love museums, but museum folks themselves will recognize there are museum people who come to museums, and there's a lot of people who don't come to museums, right? So the question also is, how can we use some of the museum tools to then turn museums inside out, as a lot of folks have been talking about, and really bring these messages in very unexpected places. And I think that's something that might be very self-obvious to people in Gen Z, but that, at least from our perspective, or my perspective at least, you just never think of, right? So that's the sort of super secret weapon that you might have that could apply to both museums, but also other institutions.
So hi, my name is Artavista. I was born and raised in Miami. I'm an environmental and social justice activist and artist. I'm also a Duke freshman, so I've been to the National Museum, and I really love it. So my question kind of stems from because this panel is called the Cataloging the Past and Shaping Our Future, Museums Change the Narrative. So I wanted to kind of touch on the point that Franklin made about museums, and I really love museums. I go to them all the time, and I really enjoy seeing the art as well as learning different scientific narratives. But I would argue that museums also have sort of a controversial reputation in terms of how they've dealt with indigeneity and a long history, which is still continuing, of disrespecting indigenous nations, and for example continuing to have artifacts and human remains without the consent of indigenous nations that they are rightly deserve to have. So I wanted to ask in terms of how museums can change that narrative, and especially considering climate, not solely communicating the science, as well as what's considered normal advocacy in terms of climate justice, but as well as including indigenous voices and including BIPOC voices, and making sure that they are centered in that narrative towards shaping a safe, sustainable, and just future for all.
I mean, here.
Yeah.
You're changing the narrative right now. You're going to further change the narrative. Just to speak to the question of artifacts, because obviously we talk about it a lot. I mean, Elgin marbles, why won't the British Museum do that? I don't understand. we talk about, there's a new film called The Homie, which is based off of a looted artifact from Congo, I believe. The Dutch Pavilion will give itself over at the Venice Biennial this year to a Congolese group, which is going to be displaying an object that sits in the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts that they don't want to give back. The question goes on and on and on. Again, for myself, I return to speculative fiction. I did an exhibition that came here in 2009 called Neo-Hoodoo, Art for a Forgotten Faith, and it was about the artifacts that are stolen in what is called the House of Art Detention on East 82nd Street and 5th Avenue. No Met people here. Right, so we're giving ourselves, and I can tell from where you're coming from in your question, and you're answering a lot of the question, you're going to be changing those narratives. But museums, we have the opportunity to do exactly what you're talking about, and I think that you have reason to have hope. Just as Jake was touching on, those issues are part and parcel going to come to the fore, more so for those who are closer to them. We've had the opportunity to be involved with a fellowship program around diversifying art museum leadership initiatives supported by the Ford Foundation and the Walton Family Foundation. Those kind of things are changing the experiences that people bring into leadership roles, as we've touched on. So, hopeful. I loved your question.
And yes, and thank you for that question. I think natural history museums in particular have a very painful and problematic history in this space, right? In terms of the not only the ways in which indigenous cultures, I think cultures from the global south, have been displayed, exhibited, or represented in the museum, the ways in which artifacts and ancestral remains have been collected, are still held within spaces. And I do think, kind of pulling back a little bit to the bigger picture, I think the issues around climate, in my mind, are part of a larger set of issues on how do we move towards a more just world, of which addressing issues of climate are part of that, but then understanding the differentials of who climate, the environmental repercussions of climate are impacting, because there's a differential impact on race and economics and other issues, is important. And we can't get there unless we also simultaneously both acknowledge and repair some of our difficult history, and create space for new types of partnership and collaboration. So, we didn't really touch on it much, but I do think there's a core here that's really about reimagining the museum in a more just world and what a museum looks like in a more just world. And the work on climate is part of that, but it's really part of a larger agenda.
And definitely thank you for your question. And I think there's this ultimate challenge, and I think we might have time for one more question, so raise your hand while I finish this. But on the productivity of those types of conversations within the general audience that a museum affords. And this is something that, again, I maybe was implying, but just to be very direct, as the museum gets bigger, as you go from Science Museum in Minnesota to AM&H, touching on that many audiences is very similar to mass media. You just necessarily have fewer messages and narrower messages in terms of how you're going to contain and connect with these different folks. And so holding on to that social trust is this question of, where is my audience, right? And that is uncomfortable for us climate people who know that the people who will suffer the most over climate are not someday in the future, although that's real, right? But literally people in Pacific Islands right now, are like pointing to where they grew up, and it's gone, right? And we know that, but that's so far from the general public, particularly in America, and their awareness. The question is, like, how do you edge towards that? That's, I think, where that Trojan horse is coming in, right? How do you live, and as a practitioner, how do you live with the horror of knowing that and watching that and feeling that, and yet your audience is arguably oblivious and has no awareness whatsoever? So how do you bring them into that conversation with all these different techniques while also not sacrificing your ideals and the truth, right? The authentic truth of what's actually happening. And that that's the flip side to the opportunity of museums, I would argue. It's really, really, really hard to actually square that circle.